Okay, good morning, everybody. And we are going to carry on our discussion about the history of life on Earth. Hopefully I'll get through it with my voice intact, because I'm still a little bit croaky and everything. But this is where we finished off last time. And we were talking about this monumental time in the evolution of life on the planet, which we refer to as the Cambrian Explosion. And the Cambrian Explosion is marked by a monumental change in the structure of the fossil record. All of a sudden in the fossil record, there appear all sorts of very, very diverse groups, which had not been apparent in the fossil record before. And it's evident that there is a sudden explosion of different forms. Many of them appear to have been, one could almost think about them as being kind of experimental forms of adaptations. And the one thing that has to be said about this, if I can get the next slide up, is I want to emphasize this is a change in the fossil record. Have a look at this diagram and you'll see these solid white arrows here. This means that we actually see fossils of these groups appear in the fossil record. What is important to realize is that the roots of those groups must lie behind here, but we don't see them. We don't see them in the fossil record, probably because most of them were soft-bodied and probably relatively scarce. So those are two strikes against being fossilized, right? Being rare and being soft-bodied. The group that we see in this era here are these strange soft-bodied forms called the ediacarans, which we do have a few fossils of. The ediacaran fauna disappears entirely at the start of this Cambrian explosion. And suddenly at the end of this ediacaran here, at the end of the Proterozoic, the era of primitive life, suddenly there appear in the fossil record all of these very, very, very diverse groups. And many of these groups, by the way, are still extant. These are groups which we still see today, although in very, very different forms. The sponges, the cnidarians, those are the jellies, sea anemones, those kinds of things. Echinoderms, the sea stars, and the chordates, these are our groups. And our roots lie, echinoderms, by the way, are cousins to us, evolutionary cousins. And our roots lie here in the Cambrian as well. All sorts of other groups, which we did not see here earlier on here, although their ancestry must lie back here somewhere. So this is a great question. What is it that's led all of a sudden in a very short time, within 10 million years or so, this explosion of different diverse forms? It's still a matter of conjecture, but one thing which we may have spurred this was actually the evolution of predation. That prior to the Cambrian explosion, things like the ediacaran fauna and probably the ancestors of all of these groups maybe subsisted rather on other forms of feeding and nutrition. Maybe they had symbiotic relationships with algae or something like this. Maybe they simply absorbed nutrients from their environment. Whatever, they weren't feeding on one another. But somewhere here, some groups developed the ability to actually prey on the other groups, to actually feed on them. And this spurred a dual race in evolutionary terms. And first of all, if you've got organisms preying on you, the evolutionary pressure, the natural selection is going to drive towards those which can survive that predation. Who survives? The organisms that survive are those with heavy armor around them, with protected in some way. When that happens, when the prey species begins to resist predation, that drives an evolution in the predators to develop better and better ways of preying on these other organisms. we drive now towards things like the development of heavy claws or heavy jaws or things like this, things that can crunch through armor. So one of the things that we notice in the Cambrian is that many of these groups here have developed defensive mechanisms. Even the sponges that appear here have heavy spicules and things which could, to resist predation. The Cnidarians have developed stinging cells which are defensive but can also be offensive, can be used for capturing prey. Echinoderms, for example, have heavy armament. They have a heavy skeleton to protect them, and on and on and on. We see the sudden in diversity of different forms, some of them quite extraordinary. But it is a very good supposition that one of the driving forces may have been the evolution of predation, and then the evolution of defensive mechanisms, and then the evolution of further predation to overcome those defensive mechanisms. So the roots of most modern groups of organisms lie right there in the Cambrian. The next major step that we're going to talk about is the evolution of adaptations which will allow colonization onto land. So if we were walking from Harlem all the way to the college, we'd now be standing somewhere near City Hall or at the base of the Brooklyn Bridge, somewhere there. And so it's very late in the whole history of the planet. And the movement onto land was, in fact, extremely difficult for the following reasons. First of all, if you're in water, you actually have no need to resist the forces of gravity. You have no weight when you're essentially when you're in water. You're supported by the buoyancy, by your buoyancy in the water. You're effectively weightless. This is what allows jellies to be jellies in the ocean, for example. Without a skeleton, they're perfectly fine because they're entirely supported by the water. As soon as you move up into land, you have to have adaptations to resist the forces of gravity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when you live in an aquatic environment, you may have to be adapted to living in seawater or whatever, but you're essentially surrounded by water, so you're not going to dehydrate very easily. Move up onto land, and all of a sudden you have to contend with the fact that you're going to dry out. And the dehydration, both of the organism itself, but more especially dehydration of its eggs, that thing, means that the organism has to adapt its reproductive strategies to being up on land. But moving onto land had a huge advantage because there was nothing else there. Prokaryotes had colonized land. They did colonize land very early on, about 3.2 billion years ago. And they certainly did change the terrestrial environment, but nothing else was there. So this was open territory. And the seas were now extremely crowded. And after the Cambrian explosion, the seas were a hostile environment because they were full of predators. Everything was eating everything else, basically. Everything, the things were feeding on whatever you were sure to be sure to have a predator that could eat you. So moving up onto land had advantages that you could escape those kinds of pressures. And the first movement onto land was by organisms such as the fungi and the plants. And when we talk about plants later on in the class, we'll hear that there's an entire story attached to how plants moved up onto land. But suffice to say, once that began, it began at the margins of bodies of water, either the oceans or marshes and swamps, that sort of thing. But once plants began to move up onto land, they began to modify the land very rapidly. They created new habitats, new environments, and animals began to followed that and began to move onto land about 500 million years ago, quite shortly after the colonization of land by the plants. So there were certain groups which were almost pre-adapted for moving up onto land. Remember what I said. First of all, you've got to resist the force of gravity. So you have to have some way of moving in opposition to the force of gravity. Second of all, you've got to be able to resist dehydration. Well, there was one group which was almost pre-adapted for moving up onto land, and these were the arthropods. These were things, these were organisms, we see them now as insects, lobsters, crabs, all of those kinds of organisms which have an exoskeleton, a tough, hard exoskeleton originally developed probably to resist predation and also to be efficient predators. But that exoskeleton provided resistance to gravity, but it also provided resistance to dehydration. So they were almost pre-adapted. It should not surprise us then that the first groups to move onto land were the arthropods, and they moved extensively inland by about 450 million years ago. The next major group to follow the arthropods were the tetrapods. Now, we are tetrapods. The primitive tetrapods were evolved from a group of fishes called the lobe-finned fishes. We'll talk about this evolution again later on in the semester. But the tetrapod means four-limbed, and that is a characteristic of the ancestral form. The ancestral form was a lobe-finned fish, which had four fins, two at the front, two at the back, which were structured so that evolutionary pressure could modify them to form the limbs which we see today. And all tetrapods carry with them a history of their ancestry, in that all of us have the same structures. We have the same structured limbs. We have humerus, radius, ulna, and then our hands, metacarpals and the carpals, with 5 digits. And that is the basic model for the tetrapod limb, which persists no matter what tetrapod you're looking at. Whether you're looking at reptiles or you're looking at mammals, if you're looking at kangaroos or birds or whatever, that is our basic limb structure. And that in itself provided the basis for moving up onto land, because this limb structure and the internal skeleton of the tetrapods was what enabled us tetrapods to resist the force of gravity. At first, the tetrapods were limited to the margins of the land because of the issue of dehydration. They're not initially the lobe-finned fishes, and then the primitive amphibians that evolved from them were not strongly resistant to dehydration, and were especially tied to the water by their reproductive cycle. They had to lay eggs which depended on water for their development. And in fact, their fertilization was external, and sperm had to swim through water to get to the eggs. But these tetrapod groups evolved a system of reproduction, which was to lay an egg which was resistant to desiccation, which meant that they could then, their reproduction became freed from water. They were able to move much further inland. Second of all, the tetrapods developed skin which was resistant to desiccation. So for example, you think of the reptiles. The reptiles have, the reason that the reptiles have shiny scaled skin is because that is an adaptation. That is an adaptation to desiccation, and it allowed them to penetrate far inland. They'd freed themselves from the pressures of dehydration, and they freed their reproductive cycles from the dependency on water. So that's the movement onto land spurred the development of many, many different kinds of tetrapod groups. Now, when we look at the history of life on Earth, what we see is the continual flowering of different groups and then their extinction. So what is happening is there's a drive within these, an evolutionary drive within these groups to radiate, to diversify, to occupy ecological niches, but then countering that, there is continual pressure on those groups, which in many cases results in their final extinction. And the development of any particular group is a balance of those two forces, diversification and extinction, their speciation rate and then their extinction rate. So when we look at the development of different groups, we see that in fact the pressures on those groups arise from three major sources. The first is the great changes of the planet itself, which arise because of plate tectonics. Plate tectonics is the driving force for the structure and the changing structure of the continents of the planet. The second major evolutionary pressure force is due to mass extinction. Frequently through the history of life on Earth, there have been events which have rendered many, many groups extinct all at the same time. And the third thing to be considered is that whenever a group is either reduced to very few members and surrounded by open ecological niches, that group tends to radiate out, tends to speciate very rapidly and occupy the available ecological niches. Now, there's two circumstances under which that can happen, two major circumstances under which that can happen. The first instance is when there has been a mass extinction, where a whole range of groups have been rendered extinct and only a few groups survive. And there, obviously, many ecological niches are now available, and the groups tend to speciate very rapidly to occupy those ecological niches, driven by the competition within the founding group. The second place where such adaptive radiations occur is where we have a founding population which arrives somewhere where there are available ecological niches. For instance, a founding population which lands on a new set of islands or something like that. They tend to radiate very, very rapidly, and this we refer to as adaptive radiation. So there's three things. We can talk about plate tectonics, mass extinctions, and then adaptive radiation as being the major driving forces for the rise and fall of the different groups that we see. So let's talk first a bit about plate tectonics. It's sometimes difficult to visualize how the Earth is actually structured, but the vast proportion of the planet, of the sphere that makes up the planet Earth, the vast proportion of that is either molten or semi-molten rock. And the continents that we so confidently walk on and live on are in fact like floating crust on what is essentially a semi-molten interior of the planet. And that interior of the planet is extremely active. As we just seen in Tonga, for example, the explosion of a volcano, there are tremendous forces that work inside the planet itself, and the molten and semi-molten portions of the planet are in continual movement. They're continually rising and moving in convectional currents, And those convectional currents, which operate over a very, very long time period, actually carry along with them the continents that we see and recognize. And those continents are moving across the surface of the planet. And they're moving actually quite rapidly. It's just the planet is very, very big, and they've got very far to go before any perceptible change can be seen. But in fact, the movement, as I'll show you in a while, is actually relatively rapid. So we know that there have been major aggregations and breakups of the continents that we recognize today, at least 3 times in the history of the planet. The one that interests us most is the most recent one. And this began about 250, 300 million years ago, the change that we are still seeing today. So what has happened in our history is that at least we know about 1 billion years ago, there was one giant supercontinent. We know that about 600 million years ago, there was another giant supercontinent. And about 250, 300 million years ago, there was a giant supercontinent called Pangaea. And Pangaea was an aggregation of all the continents that we see today. Pangaea began to break up about 300 million to 250 million years ago. What happens when these supercontinents break up is that they actually split apart. And they are split apart by magma, by liquid rock from the interior of the planet, rising to the surface and spreading. And it spreads out as oceanic crust, a thin layer of basalt on which the continents float. And as that basalt is produced, it moves apart. And as it moves apart, it carries away the continents and splits up the supercontinent that you saw before. So when we look at the continents that we have today, we must recognize that what we're looking at was the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea in various stages. Each of the breakups spurred by the development of these rift zones in the continents, which split them apart and move them apart. So if the continents are moving apart like this, we only have a limited amount of space on the surface of the planet. There must be somewhere where continents are going to begin to collide with one another. So what we recognize in plate tectonics is that there are areas of rifting and of upwelling of the magma and of splitting. Those we call the spread zones. But there are areas where the continents begin to collide with one another, and the crust on which they form, or on which they float, begins to dive deep down to be melted again in the Earth's interior. The continents remain on the surface, and they may begin to collide. And those are collision zones. And we actually refer to them as subduction zones, because that is where the crust that they float on is taken into the Earth. When we look at the planet as we see it now today, this is what we recognize. Here are our continents here, faintly outlined behind. But those continents are sitting on huge plates of basalt rock. Most of Europe sits on the Eurasian plate, and Europe and most of Asia is on the Eurasian plate. Australia sits on its own plate, the Australian plate there. Africa sits on this, the African plate. Here is India, here on the Indian plate. North America here sits on its own plate there. And this is the Pacific plate here. It's the South American plate there. So there are these huge plates with their associated continents sitting on them. On one side of the these plates, have a look here at the African plate. These arrows here indicate that this here, this jagged line here going all the way up here, is in fact a spread zone. This is and it's moving apart. It's moving apart from these directions here, so it's spreading out, and it's effectively carrying these continents away from one another. Africa and South America are moving away from one another. But if they're moving away from one another, they're going to come into contention with plates on the other side, which are doing much the same thing. So, for example, this area here, the Pacific plate here is spreading, but it's coming into contact with the South American plate here and its associated plates, by the way. This is quite a complex area. In this area here, all along here, this oceanic crust is diving down underneath the plates, and is being carrying with it, by the way, a tremendous amount of oceanic sediment and stuff as well, which is full of water, which then has to get boiled off. And as a result, all around here, each of these red dots is a volcanic area. These areas of subduction are areas of tremendous volcanic and earthquake activity because of the friction and the stresses that arise from this subduction of crust. These spread zones here are areas of tremendous tectonic activity, but seldom of destructive earthquakes. Most of the activity here is on the surface. This great rift zone here, for example, spreads all the way, and it is visible up here in Iceland. It's so active here up at the top in Iceland that it actually appears above the oceans as volcanic islands. So the question then is also, what is the future history? Well, the future history actually is a continuation of this whole process, a gradual movement probably to another great supercontinent. So we know that for example, this plate here is carrying Africa northwards here, northeast really, this way. We know also that, for example, India here was once part of Africa and was carried very rapidly northeast to smack into this Eurasian plate. This collision here is what has created the Himalayas in this area, and is also what causes a tremendous amount of this collision here is what causes a tremendous amount of earthquake activity in this area. So eventually these continents are going to again coalesce in one pattern or another, and then pretty subsequently will break up again. It's a continual restructuring and restructuring of the continents. But we need to think about something. This takes place over a tremendously long period of time. And the organisms which are present on these continents remain isolated from one another for a huge length of time. During that time, they proceed along their own evolutionary path. But these continents, in addition to the fact that they are moving together and being split apart from one another, they are also being moved through different climatic areas, regions of the conditions on the continents are actually changing as they move. And as a result, the organisms associated with them are subjected to different environmental conditions. And that is a major driving force now for evolution of the groups on them. But they proceed along their own evolutionary paths. Now, for something to think about is they are isolated only as long as the continents are isolated from one another. But as soon as those continents collide with one another, what we're going to do is we're going to bring into contact the different populations that are present on on those continents. And that in itself is going to result in tremendous evolutionary pressures as those populations come into contact with one another. So these are the major ways in which plate tectonics drive evolutionary structure. First of all, is the question of isolation. Groups on the continents remain isolated from one another. Second of all, they go through different environmental conditions as the continents move. Thirdly, they ultimately come into contact again after a very long period of time. And now these entirely new populations must somehow interact with one another. So here's something of the history of the last 250, 300 million year breakup. This is how it looked about 252 million years ago. There was still a giant supercontinent called Pangaea. And look also at the distribution of the what would become the future continents. And you'll see that they lie in different geographic areas to the places where they are now. North America, much of Europe was much more tropical. Australia, Antarctica, and Africa were actually coalesced together. Initially lay quite far south, but eventually actually ended up being fairly tropical. And we have evidence of that because if you look for fossils in Antarctica, you actually find fossils of tropical fauna and flora. Here's Pangaea itself, moved relative to the surface of the Earth, but then began to break up about 135 million years ago. This down here is Australia and Antarctica. Here is Africa moving more to the equator. Here is South America, is going to move up more to the equator as well. This whole southern continent here, just breaking up 135 million years ago, this whole continent here was called Gondwanaland or Gondwana. And it consisted of South America, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia. And we see very strong records of that association. First of all, in the fossil record for all of them, the fossil record is rather similar for all of them. But second of all, in living groups of organisms, there are living groups of organisms which are unique to the former Gondwana continents. So, for example, a plant group called the Proteaceae, a very distinct plant group, are characteristic of the Gondwana continents. There are various other groups as well, which are the same. This northern continent was called Laurasia, and that is Europe, Asia, and North America. These are the great spread zones here, the initial spread zones there. And then this very interesting one here between what would become India and Africa. We're very interested in this one because it was one of the most rapidly growing spread zones. And it carried India very, very, very rapidly north to smack into Asia, to the Eurasian continent there. 66 million years ago, remembering that during all of this period here, this is the great age of the reptiles and of the dinosaurs. So what has happened here early on, the roots of those groups lie in this united Pangaean supercontinent, and they proceed through a close association still of these continents. Though they're splitting apart, they're still closely associated with one another here and very close to Laurasia. Once the continents are split apart completely. When we look at the fossil record, for example, of things like the reptiles and the dinosaurs, we see that there is a sudden radiation of all of those dinosaur and reptile groups as these separations occur. Now, 66 million years ago, this is immediately preceding the mass extinction, which led to the demise of the dinosaurs. Here's the present day here's the present day continental structure. And one of the most active of all of the spread zones is this one that's between that runs down the Atlantic, the North and South Atlantic. And this spread zone is being tracked very, very closely, of course. And it grows at a rate of it spreads at a rate of about 20 to 30 centimeters per year. So that's about that much per year. It's about as fast as your fingernails grow. So that is actually quite rapid. Of course, at that rate, the Earth is enormous. So that rate of growth, it's going to take a very long time, would take a very long time for us to visualize active splitting apart of the continents. But nonetheless, when we talk about that rate of growth over this period of time, over millions, hundreds of millions of years, we see that this amply accounts for the kind of movement that we believe has occurred in the continents over time. These processes continue today. And we know that they continue today, not because we necessarily see the continents move, but because we can track the tectonic activity, first of all, along the spread zones, and second of all, along the subduction zones. This is the subduction zone. There is a subduction zone all the way around the Pacific, for example, called the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is what has given rise to the most recent activity in Tonga. So let's just have a look at this instance in particular. The development of this continent, the continent of Australia. Australia is an extremely interesting example. It was part of Gondwanaland. And when Gondwana at this stage here and here, they remained closely associated, but to 135 million years ago. And there was one group in particular which we're really interested in, and those are the marsupials. And the marsupials were primitive mammals. Originally, these marsupials occupied all of Gondwana. They were present throughout Gondwana. They have some very particular characteristics. They were one of the first true mammal groups to have arisen. And they, first of all, have a characteristic that they bear young. When they give birth young, they give birth essentially to a fetus. And the fetus has to actually affix to a teat in a pouch on the mother and develop. Then the embryonic development is completed there. So that is one of the characteristics of the marsupials. So they originally occupied this whole area here. And after the breakup of Gondwana, the other mammal, and especially after the development of after the decimation of the dinosaurs, the mammal groups radiated extremely rapidly here throughout Africa, South America, etc. But Australia had been carried off. Here it is here, and still had its marsupial fauna. And that marsupial fauna did not develop into the higher mammals. It remained as a diverse marsupial fauna. And when we look now at Australia, this is exactly what we see. We see a diverse marsupial fauna, which is a relic of the early history of this Gondwana. We see one or two other marsupials still persist. For example, South America, and then spreading ultimately into North America with the opossums. These are also marsupials. They are relics. They are relics of this early Gondwana history that they share with Australia. So radiation of the marsupials on Australia is really interesting, because when we go there to Australia, what we see is that originally there were carnivorous marsupials, herbivorous marsupials. There are marsupials of every size, of all sorts of, occupying all sorts of different, there are desert marsupials, forest marsupials, flying marsupials. The marsupials radiated in Australia to occupy all of the same kinds of ecological niches that are available to mammals elsewhere on the planet. But we look in the rest of the planet, those ecological niches are occupied by the true mammals. They excluded and outcompeted the marsupials. They did it much better. Now there's two groups. The marsupials with their primitive form of reproduction are contrasted to the mammals, the true mammals, which are called the eutherians. And they're characterized by the fact that they have a placenta, that fetal development takes place entirely inside the uterus, and that is due to the development of the placenta. That was a huge advantage, which allowed the true mammals to outcompete the marsupials. Okay, so that tells us something about the importance of plate tectonics. Our second driving force, mass extinctions. Mass extinctions have occurred regionally many times on the planet. It appears that extinction, of course, is a major driving force of evolutionary development. And we have to accept that the vast majority of species which ever existed have in fact gone extinct. That is not to say that their lineage went extinct. We see that most species have gone extinct, but their lineage has continued as evolution has led to the diversification of the lineage. So a mass extinction occurs when there is some cataclysmic event which decimates many different groups all at the same time. And when we look in the fossil record, you'll remember that I told you that we see abrupt changes, especially at the boundaries of the eras. We see these abrupt changes in the fossil record that reflect the occurrence of mass extinctions, which rendered many, many groups extinct all at the same time. We recognize the fact that there are 5 mass, they call them the big 5 because they're actually intervening ones as well, which weren't as cataclysmic. But there were at least 5 major mass extinction events. We don't always understand exactly why those mass extinctions occurred over the past 500 million years, which is what we have the best fossil record for. These mass extinction events have occurred. They always seem to have their major impact actually on marine species. Now, I haven't talked much about the marine environment, but I want you to think how the marine environment, for example, would be affected by plate tectonics. Plate tectonics leads to the development of entirely new current structures, for example, in marine systems. So plate tectonics itself exerts a huge influence on marine populations. But for some reason, these mass extinctions always seem to have their greatest impact on marine populations. And in each of the great 5 mass extinction events, at least 50% of marine species have been rendered extinct, where the impact may have been less on in terrestrial systems. So here are the 5 greatest of all. They're not the, as I repeat, they're not the only ones. This is we can compute the extinction rate by looking at the rapidity with which species disappear from a fossil record. That is what the scale is here. Excuse me. Here's the first one here in the Paleozoic, between the Ordovician and the Silurian, the eras. I'm sorry, periods there. So this one here, it's very unclear why this occurred. Here is another one here between the Devonian and at the end of the Devonian, rather, right there. And here is the greatest one of all, and this is at the end of the Permian. Now, this one is of great interest to us because it impacted some of the mammals' earliest forebears, our earliest ancestors. Up until this time here, the terrestrial systems were ruled by a very large, very diverse group of animals, which had characteristics of both the reptiles and of the mammals. Within that group lies the ancestor of the true mammals. And these were called the mammal-like reptiles, and they were dominant right up till here. In marine systems, there were 2 huge groups. The first were a group called the Trilobites. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this at all. That is a trilobite there. And the Trilobites were a huge group, extremely diverse. They were just incredibly diverse arthropods, which had arisen all the way back in the Cambrian. And they were a major dominant marine group. The other group, which was in the marine systems, were the cephalopods, things like related to the current day octopus and things like that, but they had shells. These 2 groups were massively impacted by this Permian mass extinction. The Trilobites were rendered completely extinct. Despite their huge diversity, despite the fact that they occupied many, many, many marine niches, they were still rendered completely extinct. The ammonites were very, very badly affected, but they weren't rendered completely extinct, but their diversity massively decreased. On land, the mammal-like reptiles were completely wiped out, except for these small remnant groups, which would later go on to diversify into the mammals, as we'll see in a minute. They realized at the end of the Permian here, these organisms had occupied ecological niches all over the planet. They had occupied marine environments, all terrestrial environments, all sorts. They had penetrated through many, many, many different climatic areas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden, for some reason or another, in both terrestrial and in marine systems, the vast majority of groups were rendered completely extinct. We don't know exactly why. There have been several theories. The first was a massive uptick. And the first theory is that there was a massive uptick in tectonic activity. There was a huge global period of very vigorous volcanic activity. We know that this actually did occur because we have remnants of it. We can see it in Africa, and we can see it especially in India. There are areas dated to the Permian of huge areas of lava flow. And this may have occasioned the poisoning of the atmosphere with sulfur dioxide, various other gases. This could be a contributing factor. It would certainly explain the marine extinctions, because that would have led to acid conditions in marine systems, which are extremely dangerous. Nonetheless, whatever it was, some people, by the way, also think that it might have been an asteroid, another asteroid event. Whatever it was, the mammal-like reptiles were wiped out. What was left behind were reptile groups who survived on land and in the sea. And those reptile groups now massively diversified into what we classically know as the dinosaurs and everything else. Here is the most recent mass extinction event. This is about 65, 66 million years ago. And this is the one that you probably know of best. And this was almost certainly due to impact of a massive asteroid or meteorite with Earth somewhere off the coast of present-day Mexico. That event was so cataclysmic that it wiped out the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs, by the way, were already in decline for reasons that we're not quite sure. Their diversity was already declining. But this mass extinction event wiped them out completely. And their place was taken by these mammal groups which had arisen here. They had been kept suppressed in evolutionary terms by the presence of these very diverse dinosaur groups. Once those dinosaur groups disappeared, the mammals were able to radiate. So that is called the Cretaceous mass extinction. And it certainly was one of the very great extinction events. The surviving groups, it's wrong to say that the dinosaurs were rendered completely extinct. They were not. A surviving group of dinosaurs went on to form a very diverse and successful group, which are the birds. But most of the ecological niches that were sorry, this just gives you the evidence for the asteroid impact. Most of the ecological niches that had been occupied by the dinosaurs were now open. The dinosaurs had been rendered extinct. Those ecological niches were now available, and groups radiated out into them. And the groups which radiated into those niches were largely the mammals. So to just give you a little brief history of, again, of the mammals themselves, this ancestral mammal here, it's called a cyanodont. The cyanodonts were a group who were still very closely allied with the mammal-like reptiles. So the mammal-like reptiles, their name tells you more or less exactly what they were. They were effectively a reptile group with strong mammal characteristics. And the characteristics that were particularly mammalian about them were their tooth structure and their jaw structures, and the various other elements of their skeleton. They were much more like the mammals than the reptiles, which had a different tooth structure entirely. For example, the ancestral cyanodont had, in development, had two sets of teeth. They had a juvenile set of teeth and then an adult set of teeth. What about us? We also have a juvenile set of teeth and an adult set of teeth. The reptiles do not. They continually produce teeth. Their teeth are undistinguished from one another, and they are continually produced throughout life. There are many other characteristics. So the next thing to think about is reproduction. Well, we're not sure about the ancestral cyanodont, but almost certainly the ancestral cyanodont laid eggs, as do all of the reptiles. But remember something, and that is that there are mammals that lay eggs as well. They are this group, very primitive mammal group called the monotremes. And the monotremes, the duck-billed platypus, the echidnas, those sorts of things, they lay eggs as well. The characteristics for mammals, for all of the mammals, are as follows. They're, first of all mammals have fur. The second thing is that all mammals feed their young with milk. So those are two characteristics which are we can easily understand if we just think about our own development. The other I've given you, and thirdly, the mammals have differentiated teeth. And they have two sets of teeth. They have a juvenile and then an adult set of teeth. These are things which tie all of them, the mammal groups together. But the mammals are, in fact, very diverse, even now, a very diverse group. We have, as I've told you, we have egg-laying mammals, the primitive egg-laying mammals. We have marsupials, marsupials largely in Australia and some in islands close to Australia, and then some in South America and North America as well, which are relics of Gondwana. And then the vast majority of mammals are called the eutherians, which are the placental mammals. And if we look here, we'll see that the roots of these groups lie very far back. But look when their diversification occurred. Their diversification occurred once the dinosaurs had been rendered extinct here at about 65, 66 million years ago. And this explosion of diversity, once this group, this major dominant group had been removed, this is a typical example of adaptive radiation. The mammals were, in fact, a very obscure group for all of this period here. They were present. They had survived as groups which had arisen from this ancestral Cyanodont, but they remained as an obscure group with low diversity until the dinosaurs were removed. And as soon as the dinosaurs were removed and those ecological niches became available, there was an explosion of evolutionary diversity, which led to all of our current groups. This is typical adaptive radiation. Okay, so those three things, remember them: plate tectonics, mass extinction, and adaptive radiations. We do have to think this question of mass extinction. We can look into the fossil record, and we can work out, as we did here, we can work out what extinction rates are by seeing how quickly groups disappear from the fossil record. We can do the same thing, really, but in modern times, by looking at the rate at which organisms are going extinct around us as we speak. And the current extinction rate is estimated to be 100 to 1,000 times the background rate of the fossil record. It's a very difficult thing to do, because we have to first of all think that we have to determine how rapidly extinctions are taking place, because there are many, many species we know nothing about. There are many species which we do not know they exist because we simply haven't found them yet. If those go extinct, we know nothing about it. So our extinction rates may be higher than what we actually do observe. But we do know that the human population now has exerted such tremendous environmental pressure on the planet that we are affecting extinction rates in almost every single environmental condition all over the planet. We are we are cutting down forests, we are occupying deserts, we are damming rivers, we are polluting the oceans, etc., etc., etc. We are radically affecting environments all over the planet. And there are many people who posit that we are actually currently undergoing the start. It's not, we're not in it, but we are at the start of the 6th mass extinction. And that this 6th mass extinction is due to the success of one species on the planet. Before, the mass extinctions have arisen due to external factors of one sort or another, tectonic activity maybe, asteroids, etc., etc. This mass extinction is due to the success of one species, and that is the human species, Homo sapiens. And the reason for that is that Homo sapiens has been able to occupy virtually every ecological niche on the planet because of our adaptability. Just think about it. Think of the Inuit living in the Arctic and in Northern Europe, in the tundra. Think of humans living in equatorial areas, humans living on islands, humans living in deserts, we live everywhere. The reason for that is that we can adapt our environment. We adapt our environment around us. But when we do that, we modify the environment for all other organisms as well. And as we have become more and more successful, we've begun to exert more and more ecological pressure on other species. And it may well be that we are, in fact, looking at a 6th mass extinction, as these species are simply unable to compete with us or the pressures that we exert on them. We could take the long view and think, well, what we're doing then is maybe opening up areas for new mass adaptive radiations. But then there are many people who suggest that our impact is so great that, in fact, we are changing the structure of the planet itself, especially because we are changing the global climate patterns. And that when, in however many million years, paleontologists examine the fossil record, they will see in the fossil record very clearly that something cataclysmic happened. And it started happening about 200,000 years ago with the evolution of one single species, and that those were human beings. For this reason, many people suggest that we should say that we are living now through a new geological era, and that we call that the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene means the age of man. And what we do with it, of course, that is subject for considerable discussion. Okay, so I'll leave you alone from there, and I will see you then on Monday.